So have you ever looked across the tabletop and decided that you really rather wouldn't be playing a certain army or list? Let's talk about army choices and declining games in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd talk a little bit about declining games in Warhammer, maybe often talked about on the internet when they see certain armies out there. So I thought for this one we could talk a little bit about what it might mean in the real world. I feel like often when people talk about certain, say, overpowered armies or combos, or certain example army lists that look kind of unpleasant to face, one fairly common take, at least down in the YouTube comments, is that if someone offered a game with that sort of army list, they'd simply refuse the game, saying they wouldn't find enough enjoyment to consider playing that. In general, I'd say my first reaction might be that could be a little bit weak-spirited if you've never faced the army in question before, and might be basing a lot of opinions off the slight echo chamber that you might get on the internet. On the other hand, it's not exactly a particularly unreasonable thing to consider. Warhammer games are a fairly big commitment, usually at least 2 hours at the very least, and often much more for bigger games, plus any travel time that it takes to get to where you're playing. A lot of people out there just might not have all that much time to play 40k, and might play once a month or less, and if that's going to be your sole engagement with the game, you might want to try and seek out something that you know that there's a pretty good chance that you'll enjoy the game. For this video, I mainly wanted to talk about army and unit selection a bit more, though in reality it's certainly the smaller part of what might put people off playing a game. Whenever I've touched on the subject in the past, it seems far more common to avoid playing certain people than certain armies or army lists, likely because you've played the person before. Maybe they've done something major wrong, like some deliberate cheating that definitely wasn't an honest mistake, or just had a difficult game with them making it not fun in some way. Or perhaps two players are just very cross purposes, wanting very different things out of their games of Warhammer. Maybe some people might have hobby and spectacle standards they want to enforce as well. You might get the odd person far less keen to play things like, say, a highly proxied army, or maybe very badly or unpainted things. If they really want to see two awesome looking armies going against each other, I feel like that might be a kind of smaller one though. In terms of actual armies or army lists though, maybe these are some of the main factors that might turn people off playing them. If the army that they're playing is excessively strong, maybe skew lists or non-interactive lists, players having played the exact same thing repeatedly, or maybe just a more casual versus competitive mindset. For the first of those, if an army is just excessively strong compared with the other players, it's potentially going to make the entire thing feel far less of a game as opposed to both players having a fighting chance. Broadly speaking, at least at a competitive level, game balance in Warhammer 40k is really quite good right now, at least compared with a lot of the times in its past, but there's definitely been plenty of times in recent history when that's not been the case though, say Eldari in early 10th edition, and there's often been factions in the game that are just going to struggle against basically everything when they get super weak. Maybe Codex Imperial Agents could be the best example of that right now, quite likely to have an uphill struggle when played against virtually everything. For the majority of 40k's factions, there might be some slight power imbalance, but I feel like perhaps the thing that matters the most is the degree of optimization that a list might have. If you're going in with a cookie cutter tournament list that can play the mission really well and taking all the best stuff, you could have a faction that in theory isn't super high in the entire 40k tier ranking or whatever, and it could still be kind of problematically strong for an opponent. It could mean that a hyper-optimized list could be too much for a more casual game. It's kind of at a bit of an interesting midpoint between player skill with knowing how to build a good army list, and then of course knowing how to play with that well, but then also access to the models as well. Some players might have vast collections built up over a long time, and can have loads of flexibility with able to trot out the exact thing that works best for them right now. There also might be a bit of a mismatch between player thinking as well. Maybe a player thinking that they're running an incredibly casual list when really they're not, and not de-optimizing things anywhere near as much as they think they are. I guess that might be a little bit of a player attitude kind of problem, kind of dictating the sort of army list problem. Before we move on to the other things, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Baron of Dice, one option for getting some nice quality dice on the table, with theming appropriate enough for various different 40k factions and armies. They made some fancy custom dice for the channel a little while back and asked to sponsor some videos. Their typical offering is £26 or $32 for 25 dice, based in the USA and shipped worldwide from there. At the time of recording, they also have a Halloween sale going on, using the code SPOOKY for 15% off any order. They've got plenty of choices out there that could work for a whole bunch of different Warhammer factions, plus also the very nice channel merch ones, which I was very happy with the job that they did for them. Those are available in a couple of colours, as you can see here. In any case, a really big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. The Halloween sale should be going on for the next week or so. I'll leave a link to them down in the video description below, so if you want to grab yourself some nice chaotic blood sacrifice type dice or similar, use that code SPOOKY for 15% off. Getting back to the potential army turn-offs though, I feel like one of the other things that can really make people balk when they see an army list is if you just take a look at it and know that you won't be able to play a normal style Warhammer 40k game against them, with certain armies just not engaging in a normal way with the foe quite as much as others, even if I'd argue that this is far better than it used to be in 40k's past. In 10th edition, perhaps skew lists that tend to stat check the foe, maybe armies like Custodians, Knights, or other massed monsters and vehicles type armies. They might wind up just basically asking the question, did you bring enough anti-tank or not? If yes, then you might well win. If no, then probably not. It still definitely could lead to a good game if you've got the right balance. Maybe the same could be true with extreme hordes, with say 250 plus models on the table, which you can still absolutely do in Warhammer 40k. They don't tend to be quite as strong power-wise, but could still feel a bit of a massive slog to play against. Maybe just generally a bit disempowering if you can't handle the stat check and you don't really have too many decisions that you can make. Basically fire all your firepower into the big tough thing and hope that you can do enough to either bring down the big monster or kill the hordes. They can still potentially be a good challenge to play from time to time, but could get wearing if you're facing the same thing. Besides skew lists and things, I feel like excessive mechanics that promote non-interaction could be bad. Maybe jump, shoot, jump armies, like say jump, shoot, jump style units like Scourges from Drukhari if they get too strong, or maybe a lot of reactive moves or lone operatives taken to extremes. And I feel like gun lines can be a bit of a problem army in not really interacting in an interesting way, though I think in 10th for the most part that usually just tends to be a problem if you don't have enough terrain on the table. Admittedly at slightly higher levels of play, armies that go out to stat check the foe don't tend to work quite as well, at least for the most part. Generally most armies have enough damage to deal with them, and even if they don't, they might come unstuck playing the mission. I feel like you raise the chance of it being a problem if you're playing with slightly more de-optimized lists. Perhaps one of the best current examples of this was a list I talked about on the channel a couple of days back, basically a 2000 point Necron list that were 3 Catan and a Transcendent Catan. This one did quite well for Necrons at a tournament, though a whole load of the comments were filled with kind of horror at the idea of playing that list. Obviously it's appropriate enough if you're trying to win a grand tournament. The idea is that everyone brings their best and then everyone does their best to win with it, but I feel like this is the sort of thing that you probably wouldn't want to inflict on your friends more than once as a joke or meme, at least if you're wanting to play more normal games of 40k. I think Catan are perhaps one of the best examples of this right now, as they're just ridiculously hard to kill for the vast majority of armies. You might need an entire army's worth of firepower to bring one down, and they generally have quite good damage output that's pretty easy to use. It doesn't mean that this 6 Catan list will be stomping tournaments all over the place, as it might have trouble winning the mission and not having much objective control on the table, so it still takes a lot of skill to do well with at a top level, even if it could be far too much for a more casual scene. Then between strength and non-interactivity, I feel like actually playing the first thing one time actually usually doesn't tend to be the worst. Even if you lose or find that individual game a massive slog, it's still something a bit different and a bit of a novelty. But you might not have people rushing out to try and repeat the experience if they have a choice. Sometimes it might happen in the general meta when a very popular army suddenly gets really good. Maybe a good example of that were when Space Marines got really good in late 8th edition and everyone remembered that they had a Space Marine army to dig out. It could get a bit wearing when they were quite so heavy in the meta. In general play, faction diversity is really quite solid right now. I feel like this could be more a case if you have, say, a few regular opponents, and you might wind up playing, say, different iterations of the same 3 or 4 lists over and over, perhaps trying to take down the same tournament optimized guard list or same 18 Thunderwolves before the points updates could get a little bit wearing. Maybe feeding into the more sort of game power thing turning some people off. It often just maybe is a bit of a signalling type thing that players might have very different intents when they're approaching the game. Maybe most commonly branded as casual versus competitive online. I feel like there's maybe a little bit of baggage with competitive play. Let's say for the purposes of this video, maybe players who have the primary focus and enjoyment of the game on the tactics and gameplay and playing Warhammer as a game. Obviously enjoying the narrative and spectacle, but maybe less emphasised than the gameplay. And then people who play the game for the narrative and spectacle, usually not trying to actively lose the game, and still trying to make some clever plays and take some objectives and things, but not worrying too much about it. You get people at all ends of those spectrums, and I'd say the vast majority of 40k players tend to be somewhere in the middle. I think it's at least fairly rare for people who care literally nothing for the setting lore or their miniatures, and similar if you don't care at all about the gameplay, then you might as well just paint. but you definitely have people who are weighted very much to one end of the spectrum. And if someone turns up to a game with a hyper-optimized tournament list and wants to have a fun game outwitting an opponent with a similar mindset, it's likely that neither player is going to have a particularly satisfying game if they wind up playing a player with a very fluffy list based on very little besides what they've painted up very nicely. It's still definitely not impossible that you could have a good game like that. Lots of things could factor into that, but all other things being equal, there'd be a much higher chance of the gaming-focused player winning, and maybe not really very much being proved, aside from good list and tactics, beat someone who's not really trying too hard in that arena. I feel like that's maybe one reason why people have value judgments attributed to certain army lists. Perhaps if you see things like the Necron Catan list, people looking in or facing the prospect of going up against that are probably going to quite clearly tell that the person who's playing it is very much playing for gameplay, and that's going to be the main draw. So it might signal to another player that that's just not really the sort of game that you want. It just might not be worth it unless you're bothering to try and make your army list strong and optimized. I feel like quite a few people might take it a bit too far though, and particularly maybe more so on the internet and not thinking it through too hard, and just trying to assert all sorts of other value judgments on the player running that army list. You can absolutely run a strong and cheesy army list and still be a nice polite player who wants a fun and fair game. And competitive play is different to win at all costs, where you're generally trying to sacrifice being polite and a good person to have a game against to squeeze out literally every chance of victory. As ever with Warhammer 40K, I feel like perhaps the most important thing is the pre-game conversation here. Usually starting out with a bit more of what sort of game are you looking for, or saying I'd quite like to run this list which could be quite strong, is it best that I dial it back, or seeing your opponent's list and raising the same sort of issues. Hopefully between that sort of process you can negotiate a little bit and make sure that both players are at least on the same page. I guess this is the point where one player might choose to decline the game. Say a tournament-focused player might not want to play a super casual list if they're trying to prep for an event or something. It's just not really going to prove anything and might not be all that fun. And certainly the vice versa is a lot more talked about. It's usually just not that much fun to be tabled in a few turns by a list that you didn't have a hope to beat. As well as just power and game attitudes, it's probably worth discussing spam skew lists and counter lists. Say if you're turning up with knights, maybe make sure that your opponent's taking at least some anti-tank so they don't have no hope against you at all. Maybe asking to change it up a bit if you've played literally the exact same list of your opponents that keeps on beating you and they do have other options available. Or maybe discussing lists that might hard counter the models that you have available in your collection. Maybe a little bit of friendly list tailoring isn't the worst thing in the world if you can both do it, but sometimes it might be able to go a bit too far. With all of that, I'd certainly not be over keen to say I'm not playing if the army that you're facing against doesn't initially look too fun. I'd hope when playing Warhammer 40k the vast majority of people out there will be having at least some fun whether they win or they lose, and by passing up games that might initially look a little bit grim, you might be missing out on the chance to meet a bunch of new people and have a good time. And there can still be plenty of tactical entertainment in trying to make the absolute best of a very bad situation. You might know that you've got a tiny chance of victory going into the game, but if you manage to keep it kind of close, it might well be a sign that you've played far, far better than your opponent has, even if the outcome might not have been in that much doubt. In general, in most 40k games, there's going to be some degree of imbalance, which generally has to be dealt with a little bit. Generally, each faction tends to get their time in the sun, being unusually strong, and someone who might have previously had a fairly friendly army might suddenly be running the new meta tournament stuff, just literally because the same models got stronger. Even if things are in theory a fair bit more balanced, some factions can just counter each other kind of hard. And beyond all that, I feel like knowing whether or not a game is a good or bad matchup really isn't always the most obvious thing in the world, not until you've played it through at least once. Otherwise, playing some tough games could certainly help you learn and grow as a player if that's what you're interested in. Maybe facing some horrendous damage dealers might be able to make you a bit better against playing the mission, eking out every advantage from cover or terrain, or having the discipline to play cagey and make your opponent come to you. And as mentioned, most extreme skew lists don't wind up actually being that strong in the competitive setting, having had to trade out a lot of other good utility in their armies just for spamming one thing. In general, I'd just be kind of tempted to give seemingly unpleasant armies to face at least a chance or two. I've seen people out there very apprehensive about playing certain armies just literally from what they've heard over the internet, which while it's not unhelpful and it might well be perfectly accurate, I think it's usually best to draw your own conclusions as to whether or not something is really overpowered in your individual matchup with the player that you're playing, or whether a certain, say, skew build or gunline army is truly not fun to play against, as you might not necessarily have the same mentality as the crowd out there. In any case, I thought I'd just share a few thoughts on that. I'll certainly be interested to hear all your guys' takes down in the comments below. I guess to sum up my thoughts, to say that declining a game isn't really unreasonable if during the pre-game discussion it just sounds like it's not going to be a very good fit and fun for both players. But in general, if done for the right reasons and not used excessively, you probably don't want to be the player who'll only ever play games that they win or have a big advantage in. I feel like in reality a lot of the time, if discussed sensibly, players are maybe a bit more likely to change things out, often to try and de-optimize a list if it's really going to look like it'll probably be problematic, though still bear in mind the advantages and the fun that you can have if playing a list that might not initially look super fun, at least if not playing the exact same thing in literally every game. In any case though, I'll certainly be interested to hear your guys' thoughts. Have you ever declined games in Warhammer 40k based on the army list as opposed to players or other things? What sort of things would be your threshold for saying no to a game, at least based on the miniatures? As mentioned, a big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring the video. As mentioned, feel free to check them out if you'd like some dice appropriate for basically all of the Warhammer 40k factions. They've got really quite a big range, a pretty good quality, roll well, and they have that 15% off right now. They'll be linked down in the video description. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. And there's plenty of other things linked down in the description below. The channel dice, the Patreon page, and the discount links if you happen to be buying any models anytime soon. A big thank you to all you guys supporting. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.